Segment 1 of our lecture introduces a number of key concepts to understanding the politics of climate change and some of the difficulties inherent in addressing such a problem. We will address some other theoretical concerns in other segments, but I just want to start with some basic ones here. The first is I want to reference an article that was written in 1960 called The Problem of Social Cost by Ronald Coase, who was a famous economist and lawyer who worked for many years at the University of Chicago. He actually died recently at the age of 102. So, and as I neglected to mention, he also won the Nobel Prize for his work in economics. But he basically recognized an important insight which has influenced economists and political science ever since. He basically said, in a perfect world, disputes over the negative externalities of economic activity, okay, like pollution that results from economic activity, could be negotiated between parties for a resolution. So, for example, if a person is living next door to a factory with a smokestack, and that smokestack is creating a nuisance for that person, in a perfect world, perfect market, the person and the factory would negotiate some sort of equitable solution to deal with the problem and allow the economic activity to continue. The time spent by both the factory and the person in negotiating over that is called a transaction cost. However, imagine if every person in a neighborhood, say it's a neighborhood of 10,000 people, wants to negotiate individually with that factory. The transaction costs of this activity obviously become increasingly high for the factory. So Coase said this is why we have things like environmental regulations. Okay? They set the parameters and ground rules in advance. They reduce the transaction costs of both economic productivity and environmental protection. But Coase was a little skeptical in the sense that he thought what should be done is the most efficient solution. He said sometimes regulation might be the most efficient solution to deal with the problem of high transaction costs, but he also said that perhaps markets could be more efficient than regulations. And this is a key insight that will help us in a little bit understand the logic behind, for example, cap and trade. Another very important thinker in environmental politics is Garrett Hardin, who wrote a famous article called The Tragedy of the Commons in 1968. And his basic insight is this: when we all act rationally as individuals, many times that results in collectively suboptimal outcomes. In other words, when we all act in our individual self-interest, it can result in things that are bad for society in general. Now, what did he mean by that? Take this meadow. Looks very nice. Okay, this is the Commons, and this was typical in places like England, for example, or even in Boston Commons. So, by tradition, in a Commons, any producer or any farmer could take their animal and graze in the land to feed them. Okay, so you take this cow here, we'll call him Larry. So if Larry the cow is out grazing in this particular field, the impact on the environment is going to be pretty negligible. The farmer is doing what's in their own individual self-interest. They're taking their animal out, they're using this resource to feed the animal so that the animal will be productive in terms of, say, milk. Alright, let's say two other farmers look at the Commons and they say, well, it's in our individual self-interest to graze our animals here as well. They're going to start grazing their animals as well. So again, 3 cows aren't going to have a gigantic impact on this field. But you begin to see the logic that Hardin was talking about. Now every cow in town is going to be showing up at the Commons, and they're going to be eating from the field. Eventually it's going to reach a tipping point where this becomes not sustainable environmentally, and your Commons might look something like this. And this is more than a mere academic concern. We've seen things like this before. For example, U.S. agricultural practices in the Midwest during World War II in the 1920s are widely understood today as contributing to the onset of the Dust Bowl. All right, so you had many farmers acting in their individual economic self-interest, but they were creating a situation through agricultural practices that didn't replenish the soil that contributed to the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. So how do you solve a problem like the tragedy of the commons? Okay. Again, Hardin is telling us that the cost of individual rational behavior, in this case, the maximum grazing of animals, leads to collectively suboptimal outcome. Now, nobody can use the commons. So what can you do? You have to establish some sort of ground rules. Okay. For example, Hardin said one thing you could do is establish quotas. Okay, that, for example, you're only allowed to bring X number of cows to the field in a given year. You could charge grazing fees that farmers, if they want to use the land, they're going to have to pay money to some sort of authority, and that authority presumably will be tasked with maintaining the commons. Or you could have tradable permits, where everybody gets a permit for using the land. If a farmer uses it less than another farmer, they can sell that permit to the farmer that is using more land. And that creates an incentive for everybody to use as little land as possible because they have the possibility of making money off of these permits. And again, that's another central insight behind the logic of cap and trade. One last idea I want to talk about is the environmental Kuznets curve. Okay. You can see the x-axis here is gross domestic product per capita. The y-axis is pollution. Now, the insight of this Kuznets curve is that countries that are poorer tend to engage in types of economic activity that don't contribute to much pollution. Okay, but eventually countries begin to go through a phase of industrialization that leads to more pollution. So maybe right here you would have a country like China. Okay. People have different theories for why this might be, but the idea is that eventually countries reach a tipping point in terms of wealth, where they can afford better technology, or perhaps they have more time for recreation and want to spend more time in natural settings. But you begin to see a decrease in pollution as GDP per capita increases. Okay. This might not work equally well for all different types of pollution, but the idea here is that as countries go through economic development, they go from low levels of pollution to high levels of pollution, but eventually they reach a tipping point, either because they can afford new technology or public opinion has changed, and countries invest more in reducing their pollution per unit of economic productivity.